Washington asked to see Nnamdi Kanu. Abuja went silent. That silence told the world everything it needed to know. This was not a complicated situation. A man is in a cell. Diplomats want to see him. A government refuses. Simple. Except nothing about this is simple. Because what Abuja is really refusing is not a prison visit. It is refusing accountability. It is refusing transparency. It is refusing to let the world see what happens when Nigeria's state machinery decides a man must disappear without ever formally vanishing. The United States Embassy in Abuja submitted a formal request for consular access to Nnamdi Kanu, the detained leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, held inside a Department of State Services facility, under conditions that his lawyers describe as increasingly alarming. The request was legal. It was professional. It was grounded in international law and humanitarian protocol, and Abuja's response was to say absolutely nothing. When diplomats knock and governments freeze, that is not caution. That is panic, dressed in bureaucratic clothing. Tinubu's administration had months to prepare for this moment. Kanu's detention had already drawn international attention. The controversy surrounding his alleged extraordinary rendition from Kenya was already documented. The procedural violations flagged during his trial were already on record. Everyone could see this collision coming. And yet, when it arrived, Abuja had no answer ready. Only silence. Only delay. Only the slow, suffocating weight of a government that knows it has something to hide but cannot admit what that something is. That is what makes this moment dangerous for Abuja, not the request itself. The fear beneath the refusal. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. The diplomatic note arrived quietly, the way these things always do before they become storms. It was formal. It was precise. It cited the relevant legal frameworks. It asked for immediate consular access to Nnamdi Kanu, noting concerns about due process, conditions of detention, and humanitarian standards. On paper, it was just paperwork. In reality, it was a grenade dropped into the middle of Aso Rock. Within hours, phone calls were flying. Emergency meetings were pulled together behind closed doors. Security chiefs were summoned. Legal advisors were consulted. The question being asked in every room was not whether the request was legitimate. Everyone knew it was. The question was what granting it might expose. Because here is what Abuja could not say publicly but understood privately. Nnamdi Kanu's detention has never been clean. From the moment Nigerian operatives allegedly pulled him out of Kenya in what critics called an illegal rendition operation, the legal foundations of his case have been shaky. Court decisions had already flagged serious procedural problems. His lawyers had filed motion after motion raising concerns about the conditions of his confinement, his access to proper medical care, and the restrictions placed on his legal team. Every one of those concerns had been buried under government stonewalling and judicial delay. Now the United States government wanted to look through that same door that Abuja had spent years trying to keep locked. And Tinubu's government realized it had a choice between two disasters. Open the door and risk exposure. Keep it shut and confirm the suspicion. They chose to keep it shut. But they made one critical mistake. They thought they could do it quietly. Days passed after the initial request. No response came from the Nigerian Foreign Affairs Ministry. The U.S. Embassy followed up. Still nothing. Then a second follow-up. Still silence. The kind of silence that does not communicate patience. The kind that communicates guilt. By the third week, the story had moved beyond diplomatic back channels. Human rights organizations were already paying attention to Kanu's case. The moment word leaked that the United States had formally requested access and been met with nothing, the machinery of international scrutiny began to turn. Amnesty International issued a statement demanding transparency from Nigerian authorities. The Committee to Protect Journalists raised its voice, reminding the world that Kanu was not just a political figure but a broadcaster, and that his detention carried implications for press freedom across the region. Biafran diaspora communities in the United States, the United Kingdom, across Europe and Canada mobilized instantly. Social media filled with documentation, with testimonies from his family, with legal timelines, with satellite images of the DSS facility where he was believed to be held. Abuja had wanted to handle this quietly. Instead, it had handed the opposition a global megaphone. And that is where the real problem began. Because Nigeria's government was operating on an old playbook. The playbook that says, delay long enough, and the world moves on. That if you flood the conversation with bureaucratic language and procedural excuses, eventually the pressure dissipates and things return to normal. That worked in the 1990s. It worked in the early 2000s. It does not work anymore. In the age of global connectivity, every day of silence is not neutral. Every day of silence is a confirmation. Every non-response becomes a headline. Every deflection becomes evidence. The Nigerian Foreign Affairs Ministry finally responded at the 6-week mark. The letter was extraordinary in its uselessness. It cited security concerns. It cited the integrity of ongoing legal proceedings. It invoked the sovereignty of Nigeria's judicial process. It promised to consider the request in due course while offering no timeline, no commitment, and no honest engagement with any of the questions being raised. It was a no designed to sound like maybe. And no one was fooled. US diplomats had seen this playbook before. They had watched governments across the world wrap authoritarianism in the language of sovereignty. They had watched states use national security as a curtain behind which inconvenient people were made to disappear from public view. The response from Abuja checked every box on that familiar list, and they knew exactly what it meant. What happened next made the situation significantly worse for Nigeria. The State Department issued a public statement. The language was carefully diplomatic, but the content was a direct challenge to Tinubu's government. It expressed deep concern about the lack of transparency surrounding Kanu's detention. It noted that access had been requested and not granted. It made clear that the United States was watching and would continue to watch. For Abuja, a quiet bilateral problem had just become a public international incident. Tinubu's credibility on human rights was now formally in question before a global audience. Inside the presidential villa, the strategy sessions grew longer and more desperate. Hardliners argued that Nigeria had to hold firm, that yielding to the US request would set a precedent that foreign governments could demand access to any Nigerian detainee simply by applying diplomatic pressure. They framed resistance as a matter of national dignity, of post-colonial defiance, of refusing to let Western powers dictate the terms of Nigerian justice. It was a compelling argument. It was also a deeply dishonest one, because the issue was never about sovereignty in the abstract. Sovereignty is not a shield you raise to hide a man in a cell from the rest of the world. Sovereignty is not a mechanism for avoiding accountability when the foundations of someone's detention are this contested. Using the language of independence and self-determination to justify refusing transparency over Kanu's case was not anti-colonial. It was authoritarian. And many Africans watching this unfold understood the difference. Critics within Nigeria began saying what critics in international forums were thinking: that this was not about protecting Nigerian sovereignty. This was about protecting the narrative that had justified Kanu's detention for years, a narrative that might not survive contact with independent scrutiny. By the 8th week, leaked documents began appearing in Nigerian media. Sources inside the DSS, speaking anonymously, described conditions in Kanu's facility that reportedly violated Nigeria's own prison regulations. The leaks could not be officially verified, but they did not need to be verified to be damaging. They confirmed what too many people already believed and gave the story another wave of momentum, just as Abuja had hoped it might be dying down. The administration's response was furious and telling. Officials accused international critics of meddling in Nigerian internal affairs. They accused the United States of pursuing a political agenda. They invoked post-colonial language, casting the diplomatic request as neo-imperial interference dressed up in humanitarian clothing. In some corners of Nigerian political discourse, this framing resonated. There were genuine voices who saw Western interest in Kanu's case, not as principled human rights concern, but as strategic positioning. Who asked why the United States cared about this particular detainee and not about the dozens of others held under similar or worse conditions across Africa by governments Washington considered allies? Those were not entirely unreasonable questions. Western governments have long applied human rights pressure selectively, loudly when it serves strategic interests, and quietly when it does not. That history is real, and it is worth naming. But naming that history does not make Kanu's detention right, and it does not make Abuja's refusal anything other than what it was. By the 10th week, the United Nations Human Rights Council had taken notice. A special rapporteur on arbitrary detention began preliminary inquiries into whether Kanu's continued incarceration under these circumstances constituted a violation of international law. The inquiry was not legally binding, but the symbolism was devastating. Nigeria was now being placed in the same category as states whose human rights records it had always publicly disdained. Inside the Nigerian capital, the mood had shifted from defensive confidence to something closer to dread. Officials who had once dismissed the diplomatic request as routine now understood they had allowed a manageable situation to metastasize into a full-scale crisis of credibility. And Tinubu remained publicly silent throughout all of it. That silence was itself a decision, a calculation that speaking on this issue carried more risk than not speaking. But silence from the head of state when his government is under international scrutiny over the detention of one of the most politically significant figures in the country is not neutral leadership. It is absence. And absence at moments like this has a cost. The United States Embassy made its most significant move in the 11th week. Not a statement, not a press release. A private request for a meeting with Nigeria's National Security Advisor to review the broader bilateral security relationship between the two countries. The subject of Kanu was not listed on the official agenda. It did not need to be. Everyone in the room understood why the meeting was happening. The message being delivered without being spoken aloud was precise. Nigeria's cooperation with the United States on counterterrorism, on security assistance, on trade frameworks, on diplomatic positioning in multilateral forums, all of it existed in a relationship built on certain assumptions. Assumptions about democratic governance, about transparency, about the rule of law. When those assumptions are challenged, the relationship is challenged. And Nigeria could not afford that challenge. Nigerian officials left that meeting understanding something they had been trying not to understand for weeks. They were running out of road. The answer came on a Friday afternoon. Brief, final. Buried inside a longer statement about Nigeria's commitment to human rights and judicial independence. After careful consideration, the federal government had determined that consular access to Nnamdi Kanu could not be granted at this time, as it may interfere with ongoing legal proceedings and compromise national security interests. Denial. Dressed in careful language, cushioned with reassurances, but denial. The door stayed closed. The U.S. Embassy responded with barely restrained fury. Their official statement expressed profound disappointment and raised direct questions about Nigeria's commitment to transparency and the rule of law. Human Rights Watch described the decision as a retreat from democratic norms. Amnesty International called it deeply troubling. The UN Special Rapporteur promised to continue and expand her investigation. In Washington, members of Congress with large Nigerian diaspora constituencies began drafting legislation proposing restrictions on security assistance to Nigeria until meaningful human rights reforms were demonstrated. Most observers doubted the bills would pass in their current form, but the fact that they were being written at all signaled a deterioration in the relationship that Nigeria would eventually have to reckon with. Inside Abuja's circles of power, officials told themselves they had won. They had held firm. They had defended sovereignty. They had refused to let a foreign government dictate the terms of Nigerian justice. But what they had actually done was something different. They had confirmed every suspicion. They had validated every criticism. They had demonstrated to the watching world that when faced with a choice between accountability and concealment, Tinubu's government would choose concealment every time. And that lesson, once learned, does not stay confined to the Kanu case. It spreads. It colors how Nigeria is perceived in every other conversation, every other negotiation, every other moment that requires trust. That is the real cost of the closed door. Not the immediate diplomatic fallout. Not the critical statements from international organizations. The real cost is the slow erosion of the credibility that Nigeria needs to be taken seriously as a major African power, as a democratic example, as a voice worth listening to on the continent. Kanu himself learned of the decision through his lawyers during one of their brief, monitored visits. What he said, what he felt, what he thought in that moment. None of it was recorded. None of it was shared with the world. He remained what he had been since June 2021, present but invisible, significant but silenced. A man whose name had become a symbol and whose person had become a ghost. His lawyers vowed to continue fighting. New motions were filed. New appeals were launched. New forums were approached. But everyone understood the reality that no legal strategy succeeds without political will, and there was no political will in Abuja to resolve this honestly. And so the walls held. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that Abuja did not anticipate. Because the fallout from this refusal did not stay contained to the diplomatic circuit. It began bleeding into Nigerian domestic politics in ways that the government had not calculated for. Opposition figures who had previously avoided the Kanu issue for fear of being labeled separatist sympathizers suddenly found political cover to speak. The US request had reframed the conversation. This was no longer just about Biafran independence or IPOB grievances. This was about whether the Nigerian government operated within the boundaries of law and basic human dignity. That was a conversation politicians from every region could enter without being accused of ethnic allegiance. Prominent lawyers in Lagos and Abuja began publicly questioning the legal basis of Kanu's continued detention. Senior academics at Nigerian universities issued open letters calling for transparency. Former judges who had served the Nigerian judiciary with distinction went on record saying that the government's behavior in this case was an embarrassment to the legal profession. This was the shift Tinubu's team had feared most. As long as the Kanu issue stayed within the frame of Biafran politics, the government could manage it. The moment it became a broader rule of law conversation, it became everyone's problem. And that is exactly what happened. Social media inside Nigeria was no longer divided simply along ethnic lines. Young Nigerians from the north, from the southwest, from the middle belt were asking the same questions. If the government could do this to Kanu, who else could it be done to? If access could be denied to US diplomats, what oversight existed at all? If the courts could be paralyzed by political pressure on this case, how trustworthy were the courts in any case? These were not fringe questions. They were the questions of a generation that had grown up watching Nigerian institutions fail them repeatedly and was no longer willing to extend the benefit of the doubt. And the government had no answers, because the honest answer was the one they could not give. Meanwhile, on the continental stage, the episode was being closely watched by governments, civil society organizations, and ordinary citizens across Africa who cared deeply about what sovereignty actually means in practice. This is where the story widens beyond Nigeria's borders. Because the Kanu case had become a kind of mirror in which broader African political questions were being reflected. On one side of the debate were those who argued that Nigeria's refusal was a legitimate assertion of sovereignty, that African governments must resist the pattern of Western powers using human rights language as a diplomatic tool to pressure and destabilize governments that do not serve their interests. That the principle of non-interference is not just a technicality but a hard-won protection against neo-colonial manipulation. These voices were not wrong to raise those concerns. The history of Western interference in African affairs under the cover of humanitarian language is long and well documented. But on the other side were voices asking a harder question. Sovereignty for whom? When an African government uses the language of sovereignty not to protect its people, but to protect its power from scrutiny, when it invokes anti-colonial sentiment not to liberate but to conceal, what exactly is being defended? Not the people, not the Constitution, not the rule of law, just the comfort of those already in control. That contradiction was visible to anyone paying attention. And across Africa, more people were paying attention than Abuja expected. Leaders in the Sahel who had built their public images around resistance to foreign interference found themselves in an awkward position regarding Kanu. Because the argument that African sovereignty must be protected rings hollow if it only applies to resisting foreign pressure but not to protecting citizens from their own governments. Ibrahim Traoré could stand before crowds and speak about African dignity with credibility, partly because he had framed his movement around protecting ordinary people from exploitation, both foreign and domestic. Tinubu's government was doing something different. It was invoking dignity language to avoid a prison visit. The contrast was not lost on observers. The African Union, characteristically cautious, said nothing publicly. But internally, sources suggested that several member states had raised concerns through quiet diplomatic channels, not because they disagreed with the principle of sovereignty, but because they understood that Nigeria's mishandling of this situation was generating the kind of international attention that made life harder for all African governments trying to navigate relationships with Western powers on their own terms. When one country's behavior becomes a headline that defines an entire continent's approach to human rights and rule of law, everyone pays a price. By this point, the Kanu case had become something that transcended the man himself. It was a test case, a referendum on what kind of Nigeria exists in the 21st century, and what kind of Africa is being built around it. And in that larger frame, Abuja's closed door was not just a decision about one detainee. It was a statement about values, about power, about who gets protected and who gets buried. about whether African governments are capable of holding themselves to the same standards they demand of others. The world was watching, not just Washington, not just London or Brussels or Geneva. People across the continent were watching. Young people in Accra and Nairobi and Dakar and Kinshasa who follow these stories with the kind of intensity that previous generations reserved for football matches were watching. They were forming opinions about Nigeria, about Tinubu, about what African leadership looks like when it is tested. And that is the dimension of this story that the government in Abuja seems to have most badly miscalculated. They were thinking about the immediate diplomatic cost of granting access. They were not thinking about the long-term reputational cost of refusing it. They were not thinking about what it means for Nigeria's ability to lead on the continent when its own citizens and neighbors watch it choose concealment over accountability. But here is what Abuja has not understood, or has understood and is choosing to ignore. Walls built on fear do not hold forever. Every system of concealment has a breaking point. Every bureaucratic fog eventually clears. Every government that mistakes silence for strength eventually discovers that what you suppress does not disappear. It accumulates, it grows heavier, it waits. The Nigerian government's refusal to allow transparency over Kanu's detention is not the end of this story. It is a chapter in a longer one. A chapter that future governments will have to answer for. A chapter that the people Kanu represents, millions of Igbo men and women who see his face when they think about what it means to be marginalized by the Nigerian state, will not forget. And this is not just about Nigeria. Across the continent, governments watching this episode are learning something. They are learning what happens when you try to hide a man from the world and the world refuses to look away. They are learning that the old tools of authoritarian management, delay, deflection, bureaucratic obstruction, work less well in a world where diaspora communities organize instantly, where international human rights networks move fast, where a diplomatic standoff in Abuja can be tracked in real time by people in London, Houston, Toronto, and Johannesburg. Africa is watching, and not passively. The generation that is watching this unfold is not the generation that accepted silence as an answer. They are asking harder questions about who holds power, about who that power serves, about why the same governments that claim to speak for African sovereignty are often the first to use the language of sovereignty as a shield against their own people. The US diplomats never got their visit. The questions they came to ask were never answered. Nnamdi Kanu remains in that cell, inaccessible, unseen, his condition unknown to the outside world, his future tied to the political calculations of men who have decided that his silence is more valuable to them than his rights. But here is what the closed door cannot change. The story exists, the record exists, the request was made and the refusal was documented. History has a long memory, longer than any administration's tenure, longer than any diplomatic cycle, longer than the patience of millions of people who believe that what happened to Nnamdi Kanu cannot be the final answer to the question of justice in Nigeria. Tinubu's government made its choice. The world made its judgment. And somewhere in the distance, the reckoning is still coming, because every wall built on fear has a crack. And every crack, given enough pressure, given enough time, given enough people who refuse to stop asking the question, eventually becomes a door. The only question left is who will be standing on the right side of it when it finally opens.